So I am Deb Carroll, and welcome. I am the Communications and Administrative Assistant at the Golden Ball Tavern, and I work for our Executive Director, Katie Campbell, who is also here with us tonight. The Golden Ball Tavern Museum is a Loyalist tavern, or was before it became a museum, and it was built in 1768. And we played a part I guess during the American Revolution in local activities, there were some very interesting and important events that happened at the Golden Ball, including in 1775, the visit of General Gage's spies. They were scoping out where the munitions might be. They visited the Golden Ball once on their way out, and then they came by 2 more times. And when they were leaving to bring their report to General Gage, they actually secreted a copy of it in our museum, in the tavern, in the attic. And that was found many years later. So it's one of the many primary sources and the things in our archives, because the Jones family, who lived there for 200 years, were hoarders, I guess you could say. But we have journals and newspapers and ledgers and this diary, which we now only have a copy of. We will be celebrating the 250th, or commemorating the 250th anniversary of that visit by the spies next year. So there'll be a lot of wonderful activities going on at the museum, a special exhibit called The Spies Among Us, and we welcome you to join our mailing list, visit our website, learn more about the museum. You could visit us on the second Sunday of each month. Right now, we're having an open house and tours this coming Sunday, and we will be open 1 day a week on Thursdays starting next February. So you can learn more about us, but right now we want to learn more about the Loyalists experience from Larry. And I'll just remind you that Larry is, let's see, I have my notes right here. Larry is a freelance writer, a communications professional, and he's published articles in American History, the Boston Globe, the Chronicle of Higher Education, among other places. And he's going to tell you why he chose to enter into this interesting field of writing about, I can't think of the correct word, but I'd say parts of history that interest Larry. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Larry.
Thank you, Deb. First of all, I want to thank you and Katie Campbell, the director of Golden Ball Tavern Museum, for inviting me to speak. And as Deb Carroll has mentioned, I'm not a professional historian. I'm a research psychologist by education. But when I retired some 20 some years ago, after a 30-year career with a public policy research and consulting company in Cambridge, that time it gave me an opportunity to explore those singular moments in history that I had heard about but never had time to pursue. And by singular moments, I mean the the big things that you might read about in textbooks, but the sort of behind the scenes, the little quirky things that make history, to me at least, very fascinating. My talk today is about one of those singular moments in American history. And as Deb said, please type any questions you have, and I'll try to get to them at the end. And if I don't, each slide has my email on it, so you can email me, and I'll, after this is over the next week or two, try to get to any of your questions and get back to you. It's been said that history is written by the victors. So it's not surprising that the story of loyalists who lived in the American colonies and held fast to their loyalty to the crown is not as widely known as that of the Revolutionary War's victors, that is, the patriots. In many ways, loyalists suffered not only the slings and arrows of their patriot neighbors as the drumbeat to independence from Great Britain grew louder, but also many loyalists suffered the agony of fleeing their towns and homes for another country. Historian Thomas B. Allen characterized the Revolutionary War as America's first civil war. And indeed, I would agree with that characterization. Various historians have estimated that by the end of that conflict, somewhere between 60,000 and 100,000 people from all the colonies fled their homes. Before the outbreak of that war, the tumult was already reaching up and down the eastern seaboard. It was most contentious, though, in what several historians have called the cradle of American history, of American Revolution, Massachusetts. From Boston's furious streets into the Massachusetts colony's hinterlands, whether originating with individuals or stimulated by local committees of correspondence, which were bodies formed to exchange information and ideas within and among the several colonies, and later with local committees of safety, which were bodies that coordinated military and security issues. Antagonisms ran hot and heavy among the populace. Loyalist Anne Holton lived in Brookline, Massachusetts, then a town of about 600 souls, now a town of about 60,000 souls, surrounded on three sides by Boston. She lived there with her brother Henry. They had come here from England somewhere in the 1760s, I believe. Her brother Henry was the Crown's Commissioner of Customs in Boston. On September 7th, 1767, Anne Holton sat down to write a friend a letter that promised, quoting from the letter, many things to tell you and some very interesting events I must communicate. This and later letters were collected in a book, Letters of a Loyalist Lady, as it was published a century and a half later. And some libraries have it, including the one that I frequent. In addition to reflecting upper-class life during a particularly fractious period in colonial America, the letters offered a first-hand view by a fervent loyalist of political relations during the times. This is a painting of a loyalist lady, not necessarily of Anne Holton. Nobody's been able to specifically identify a picture of her, but it's what a woman of that class and time might have looked like. By 1776, excuse me, the Holton siblings, brother and sister, had had enough of the tensions in their colony and bolted for England's friendlier shores. Anne wrote in one of her letters that during their stay in Boston, ruffians, as she called them, armed with swords and pistols, had broken into their house, smashed windows, and beat and shot at them. She also detailed in some of her other letters the detarring, feathering, and whipping of a loyalist customs officer. And here's one such um, episode of tarring and feathering that you might have come across. She wrote of a Tory woman being treated with great rudeness and indecency by rebels who stripped her and her children of their clothes. Similarly angered at the colony he was leaving, brother Henry described rebellious Massachusetts patriots as banditti of the country, amongst whom there is not one that has the least pretension to be called a gentleman. They are a most rude, depraved, degenerate race, and it is a mortification to us that they speak English and can trace themselves from that stock. End of his quote. During the Holton's time in Boston, revolutionary fervor had amplified. The Sons of Liberty were protesting import and other taxes. Crowds were lynching and burning effigies of disfavored figures, and rival mobs were clashing. One night in 1770, for example, revved up patriots broke into the mansion of Royal Lieutenant Governor Thomas Hutchinson and nearly demolished it. As another example of the turmoil, British soldiers fired into a rock-throwing mob near the old State House, killing 3 and fatally wounding 2 in what came to be called the Boston Massacre. So things were heating up, certainly. Although thousands of Loyalists left the American colonies before, during, and after the Revolutionary War, many others remained. Some, forced under duress to take loyalty oaths, stayed in their towns and villages. Others, out of practicality, continued with their businesses or farms. And whether genuine or feigned, some professed acceptance of the patriot cause, even if they didn't believe in it. To remain loyal to the crown posed a harsh choice for loyalists: to live with scorn where rooted, or flee for friendlier but alien regions. Loyalists felt deep attachment to the mother country and the crown. Some of them held tight to the sovereign as head of the Anglican Church and the tradition of parliamentary monarchy, while others focused on family prominence, trading connections, power, prestige, and dread of civil war in coming to their loyalist convictions. As for patriots' motivations, historians cite ambition for a new order, rejecting the crown's ever-increasing restrictions and taxes, resentment of a royal ban on settlements west of the Appalachians. The Appalachians at that time was pretty much a wild and woolly, highly contested area amongst the British, the French, the indigenous people. And rising duties on sugar, textiles, and coffee, and outlawing of colonial currency. Religion, too, was a wedge. Quoting author Thomas B. Allen, virtually every Anglican clergyman in America became a loyalist, and Presbyterians were labeled rebels. End of quote. Intolerance became the norm. One Massachusetts loyalist expressed his dissatisfaction this way, quoting that person: to such a point of madness have the people arrived that we are now forbidden not only to speak, but to think. Massachusetts was not alone in experiencing such friction. New York City, Philadelphia, the Carolinas, and Georgia were also strong Tory strongholds. With each crown crackdown and patriots' often violent reactions to things like the 1765 Stamp Act, which required a crown stamp on each piece of paper, the 1767-68 Townshend Revenue Acts, the 1768 military occupation of Boston, the 1773 Tea Act, and the 1774 Coercive Acts, which were also labeled, particularly by the colonists, the Intolerable Acts, and which included the 1774 Massachusetts Government Act, which put the election of most government officials under the control of the crown. When all of these happened, colonists were more and more at one another's throats. Imposition of the Intolerable Acts cast loyalists as foes of a country careering toward independence. Such was the vitriolic tension between Massachusetts patriots and loyalists, who, following the sobriquets of those of like mind across the Atlantic, also went by Whigs and Tories, respectively, as America edged nearer rebellion. John Adams is reputed to have written or remarked, "It happens in the countryside." And what I'm going to tell you next is several examples of how and where the countryside was as riled as Boston. These are the kinds of things that most history texts and so on, commentary, don't really dwell upon. They all seem to focus on Boston, but not so. Things happen in the countryside. As my first example, Here's a place that's perhaps familiar to so many of you since it's sponsoring this talk. In Weston of Middlesex County, Isaac Jones was a tavern keeper and he was a loyalist. Now, I'll read to you what happened at Isaac Jones's Golden Ball Tavern. By the way, this is the tavern the Golden Ball Tavern Museum as it now stands, and it's a magnificent example of colonial architecture at that time with 12-foot high ceilings and um, grand staircases and some of the original wallpaper and so on. And it's also because it stayed within descendants of Isaac Jones for six generations. Also showed some of the changes. It also shows some of the changes that went as time progressed until 1964, when the Golden Ball Tavern was given over as a museum. I'll read to you this article because it's probably too small for you to make out on your screens or to see. This is from the Massachusetts Gazette and the Boston Post Boy and Advertiser of April 1774. Quoting from the article, or I'm going to read you the entire article because it's fascinating. We hear from Weston in the county of Middlesex that on Monday evening, the 21st of instant, a number of people appeared before the house of Captain Isaac Jones, innholder, in that town, gave a loud Indian whoop, and immediately went off without speaking to any person in the houses. That on Monday night last, between 9 and 10 o'clock, a number of persons, supposed near 100, again appeared there, and Captain Jones having that morning gone a journey to Uxbridge, they fell to breaking the windows of the house, stove in all in the lower rooms, and then the chamber. Mrs. Jones was then in bed with a young infant having lain in about 3 weeks. The windows of her room did not escape, but she lay exposed to the inclemency of the weather, it being rainy 2 hours. Near 30 of the people entered, disguised with paints, paper visages, that is, masks, and so on, and ransacked the whole house from cellar to garret, without breaking down any part excepting 2 panels of a partition. Being asked what they were in search of, they said Jones, and we would have him. But being told he was gone a journey, they made free with the bottles of liquor in the cellar, as also the liquors that were in the bar room, breaking or carrying off the bowls, mugs, and so on. Also about 100 lemons and a half a cask of raisins. For some reason, that half a cask of raisins always gets to me. Several of them were known by the people in the house and called to by name when they went off. Several other circumstances upon this discovery, our informant supposes, will be given when a particular account is taken. A military watch was thought necessary. Accordingly, the colonel ordered one from the militia in Weston to be every night. Now, what caused the crowd to riot like this? The article concludes with this paragraph. Captain Jones purchased tea at Albany last winter, not subject to a duty, and had retailed it out, which is said to be the cause of the resentment against him. In actuality, the tea he purchased was Dutch tea, not English tea, but so be it. They didn't know that. Isaac Jones, a loyalist, had opened the Golden Ball Tavern in Weston in 1770 or thereabouts. He had advocated compromise over conflict with Great Britain at personal risk to himself and his family, as we just saw. Once labeled an enemy to his country, he ultimately did join the Patriot cause and made significant contribution to the new nation. Oops. Oh, wait a minute. Let me get to the next slide. That's not the next slide. There we go. As I said, I'm going to give you several examples of what happened in the hinterlands beyond Boston. Going further afield in the colony in Plymouth County, Daniel Dunbar described at the time of Halifax, Massachusetts, gentleman, was from infancy loyal to the king, and the British government. Dunbar served as a second lieutenant in the Crown Militia at Halifax, Massachusetts, that is. In 1774, a mob broke into his house, dragged him out, and beat him. He left for refuge in nearby Boston. When the British withdrew from that city, he sailed with the Royal Army for Halifax, Nova Scotia. Sailed with the Royal Army for Halifax, Nova Scotia. Massachusetts banished him, and you're going to hear more about banishing several times later, and we'll get to the reasons therefore and the consequences thereof. That same year, Daniel's son Jesse bought cattle from a Tory. Young Dunbar had slaughtered and skinned one of the animals when Whigs, intent on teaching him a lesson about dealing with the enemy, set upon him. His tormentors tied him to the dead cow's belly, put them in a cart, and drove 4 miles to neighboring Duxbury, where another mob took over. Some of the mob used the cow's stomach to beat the captive about the face. The rioters then took young Dunbar's money and left him and his cow's stomach to find his own way back home. Elsewhere in the hinterlands beyond Boston, in 1770, merchant Ebenezer Cutler of Oxford in Worcester County tried to run 2 wagon loads of boycotted English goods out of Boston under cover of night. Crowd of indignant citizens, alerted by a night watch, pursued and overtook him and forced him to return to his home with the goods. A little later, the local committee of correspondence impounded the goods. In a case described by John Adams, yes, that John Adams, who represented Cutler in some of his court cases, 2 of the people present that night were sued by Cutler, who sought £5,000 damages for assault, false arrest, and other enormities, as he called it. Although he won his case in the Worcester Inferior Court, a trial on appeal in Superior Court of Worcester found for the defendants. A writ of review filed a year later again cleared one of the defendants, but found the other liable, but for only £15. In a final act of retaliation in 1775, the Worcester County Committee of Correspondence in nearby Northborough accused Ebenezer Cutler of speaking, quote, many things disrespectful of the Continental and Provincial Congresses, acting against these bodies' resolves, offering to assist British General Thomas Gage, and other traitorous activities. Fearing for his safety, Cutler fled to Boston, parting without his effects. The next year, he accompanied the British Army to Nova Scotia, eventually settling there, another loyalist banished by his home state. Attorney Daniel Bliss of Concord, Massachusetts, made no bones about his bent. Royal Governor Hutchinson named Bliss a justice of the peace, commenting that he was a very active Tory. When neighbors learned British Army officers were visiting Bliss in Concord to assess the town's preparations for rebellion, they threatened to kill him and the Britons. Bliss fled, later sending his brother Samuel to spirit away his family and save what they could of his holdings. But to no avail. The Public Record Office in London, England, has a copy of a complaint against his estate, signed in 1780 by John Hancock. Yes, that John Hancock. And John Avery Jr., resulting in the forfeiture of Bliss's property. Bliss joined General John Burgoyne's army, or often called General Johnny Burgoyne, assuming an important position, that is Bliss, assuming an important position in the Niagara region. At war's end, Bliss settled in New Brunswick, Canada, where his legal work brought him prominence. Meanwhile, Massachusetts banned him from returning upon penalty of death. Again, banishment. Nathaniel Ray Thomas was a Loyalist leader in Plymouth County's Marshfield, the only Massachusetts town openly faithful to the British legislature and the crown. In 1774, Thomas welcomed 100 British soldiers to quarter on his estate, moving his own family that winter to accommodate the soldiery. Resulting threats from surrounding towns drove Thomas away, along with about 200 Loyalist neighbors. Attaching himself to Crown forces, he served in Nova Scotia and New York before fleeing to England in late 1777. The Public Records Office in London preserved a tribute to Marshfield's dutiful deportment, saying this, and I'm quoting the Public Record Office document: through a 10 years political struggle and warfare, Marshfield never deviated from, but had uniformly and invariably preserved and maintained its integrity and loyalty. Town, the only one in New England that, in spite of the threats and intimidation of surrounding towns, counties, and provinces, dared publicly and collectively to own and acknowledge their allegiance and the supremacy of the British legislature. On April 19th, 1775, open armed fighting occurred at the Battle of Lexington and Concord. The situation facing Loyalists at this point grew even more dire. Hearing the news of that battle, Joseph Sturdivant, the local healer in the town of Halifax near Plymouth, galloped north to aid the British Army, riding so fast that he lost his saddlebags along the way. General Gage rewarded him for both his effort and his loyalty by giving him a commission as captain in the British Army with responsibility for the Army Hospital. Unfortunately for Dr. Sturdivant, he contracted smallpox and died 4 months later. Bemoaning her husband's fate, his wife Lois wrote, quoting her, "My dear husband departed this life at Boston in his 55th year, where he was driven by a mad and deluded mob for no other offense but his loyalty to his sovereign." The Massachusetts Government Act of 20 May 1774, one of the intolerable acts, prescribed that thenceforth the Massachusetts Council, the upper house of the legislature, would no longer be elected, but would instead be appointed by the governor on a royal writ of mandamus. Abijah Willard, a prosperous landowner in Lancaster County, 50 miles northwest of Boston, was one of those hated mandamus counselors, enduring several beatings and confinements at the hands of patriots. On the morning of the Battle of Lexington and Concord, he saw rebel militiamen marching to battle and rode immediately to join General Gage, the British general. Gage promptly commissioned him a captain in a first company of Loyal American Associates. When the British evacuated Boston a year later, Willard accompanied them to Nova Scotia. He returned to New York for a while, but he was again evacuated to Nova Scotia. Massachusetts formally banished him in 1778 and confiscated his property. A year later, he died in St. John, New Brunswick. And as I said, I promise we'll get to banishment in a little more detail later. But first, I want to also say that women too suffered for their loyalist convictions. Many were forcibly exiled or exiled themselves voluntarily. Anna Borland, wife of John Borland, Esquire of Braintree, Norfolk County, fled with her spouse and their 9 children to Boston in 1774, seeking the protection of Crown forces. John died in 1775. To keep her sons from being pressed into the rebel army, Anna sailed first to England and later to Tory-friendly New York, where she felt she might have, as she put it, more speedy communication with those who may be disposed to relieve her. End of quote. Jane Gordon, widow of Boston merchant Alexander Gordon, sought British Army commissions for 3 sons, lest the youths serve with the despised patriots. The widow Gordon aroused further enmity among her neighbors by nursing British officers wounded at Bunker Hill. In 1775, she left Boston for Nova Scotia, and then after that to England, settling in Edinburgh, Scotland, where she died in 1789. The Loring family were staunch loyalists whose patriarch, John Loring the Elder, had been a captain in the Royal Navy and later sheriff of Suffolk County, Massachusetts. Elizabeth Lloyd married his son, Joshua Loring Jr. So her name then became Elizabeth Lloyd Loring. But she was also known as Betsy. And this picture is thought to be a fairly accurate portrait of her. Described as a playful, she was rumored to have romanced William Howe, commander-in-chief of British land forces in the colonies, while married to Joshua Loring Jr. Described as a playful blue-eyed blonde, Elizabeth Loring, aged 25, was Howe's constant companion as he gambled and drank the nights away. Some characterized Mrs. Loring as the mistress of General Sir William Howe, causing him to pay more attention to Mrs. Loring than to the war he was supposedly prosecuting. After all, his strategy and tactics did begin to lose some of their edge, starting about the time they met. On the other hand, she might instead have been a loyalist wife who simply socialized as an elite provincial woman with a British general would be expected to do. So there's people who think both one thing or the other regarding her, that she was his paramour or she was simply a friendly local, as it were. Whatever the case, the Loring family left Massachusetts for Nova Scotia with the British Army in 1776, then moved from Halifax to Crown-friendly New York. Joshua Loring Jr. died in Englefield, England in 1789, leaving behind Elizabeth and 5 children. Betsy, his widow, Elizabeth, received a loyalist pension from the crown until her death in 1831. When British soldiers evacuated Boston in March 1776, hundreds of Massachusetts loyalists fled to Nova Scotia or New Brunswick in Canada, both of those places being relatively close to Massachusetts. Because the first United States Census did not occur until 1790, the percentage of the Massachusetts population that fled is not possible to gauge accurately, but assuming various things like that there were 80,000 to 100,000 loyalists from all the colonies, and working from a modern Census Bureau estimate of the total 1776 population in all 13 counties, I estimate that roughly 4% of the population in the American colonies, that would include Massachusetts, 4%, left for Canada, East Florida, which was then in English hands, Bermuda, Jamaica, and of course, England during the war. Several thousand enslaved Blacks, freed because they had pledged allegiance to the crown, fled to Canada. Of those, about 2,000, unhappy with how they were treated there, sailed from Nova Scotia in 1792 for Africa and helped found the nation of Sierra Leone. In 1778, 5 years before the war ended, Massachusetts enacted the Banishment Act, the full title of it being the Banishment Act. The Banishment Act of the state of Massachusetts, an act to prevent the return to this state of certain persons therein named and others who have left this state or either of the United States and joined the enemies thereof. The act goes on to name, specifically by name, in the act, some 308 Massachusetts Loyalists, including former officials of the province of Massachusetts Bay, as banished from the province, never to return upon penalty of death. With the signing of the Treaty of Paris in 1783, ending the war, Loyalists who had remained in the States, as well as those who had relocated, found themselves strangers in strange lands. Many wishing to reclaim their homes faced vindictive treatment at the hands of the war's winners, the Patriots. The Treaty of Paris had recommended that states restore all property and rights taken from Loyalists, and the Continental Congress urged all states to comply. This caused an uproar in Massachusetts. The March 10, 1783 Boston Gazette reported that the first returning Loyalist was run out of town, quoting the article, with a handspike under his crotch and a halter around his neck. Not a very warm welcome. Boston organized a committee of correspondence to cooperate with like committees in other towns to prevent refugees from returning. 12 Marshfield Loyalists who had left with the British evacuation were promptly arrested by local authorities on their return to Marshfield and thrown into Plymouth jail for 4 months. Harsher still, Samuel Stearns, an almanac publisher of Axton, Massachusetts, was arrested within a day of his arrival back home in 1784 and kept in jail for 3 years. Even more extreme, distiller John Amory, upon returning home to his wife and 10 children in Boston, was interrogated the very next day by representatives of both the Boston Committee of Correspondence and the House of Representatives. Failing to renounce the king, he was deported to Rhode Island and told not to return upon penalty of death. Writing to her husband, John, who was in Paris, Abigail Adams reported, quote, "The spirit which rises here against the return of the refugees is violent. You can hardly form an idea of it." One Tory woman wrote, quoting her, "The rebels breathe the most rancorous and malicious, malignant spirit everywhere. Committees and associations are formed in every colony and resolves passed that no refugees shall return nor have their estates restored. In short, the mob now reigns as fully and uncontrolled as at the beginning of our troubles." As historian Richard B. Morris put it, quoting him, "The scars were not easily erased, not all the wounded completely healed, nor could families too quickly forget the tragedy of a civil war fought by a divided people for independence from a great world empire." End of quote. But return to Massachusetts some did. Even several among the 308 individuals specifically named in the 1778 Massachusetts Banishment Act. Many returnees were scrutinized intensively for their fitness to re-enter America by locally appointed committees or by the courts. Results varied. Prominent Salem physician and educator Dr. Edward Augustus Holyoake, son of the 9th Harvard president, was deemed to be moderate Tory, not a high-flying Jacobite. After his return, he embraced the patriot cause. On the other hand, another Tory returning to Hampshire County further west was jailed after informing the local committee of correspondence examining him that he, quote, "was in tongue a Whig, in heart a Tory, and that his ass was a committee of correspondence." That's telling him. In Essex County's Marblehead, Loyalist merchant Thomas Roby and his family had been subjected to many irritating and insulting remarks when they fled town for refuge in Nova Scotia. Upon departing at that time for Canada, his wife had been heard to retort, quote, I hope that I shall live to return, find this wicked rebellion crushed, and see the streets of Marblehead so deep in rebel blood that a longboat might be rowed through them. End of her quote. When they sailed back to Marblehead to return home in 1783, a hostile crowd gathered to meet their ship. During the night, however, quoting a chronicle of the time, during the night, however, a party of gentlemen went on board of the schooner and removed them to a place of safety in a distant part of town. Urgent appeals were made to the magnanimity of the turbulent populace, and the excitement subsided. Merchant Roby was offered forgiveness in exchange for establishing an inexpensive dry goods store in town. Mr. And again, a loyalist chronicler wrote a century later about him. Mr. Roby went into business again in a limited extent and died in Salem about 1812, well esteemed and respected. This, by the way, is the Roby House, still standing in Marblehead at 137 Washington Street. And like most commercial establishments of the time, the family lived in one part and the commercial activities were carried out in another part of the building. This was one of the first all brick buildings also made in Marblehead. When it came to regaining real estate and obtaining repayment of debts after the war, variability reigned. Thomas Roby won 7 of the 8 cases for debt or trespass that he brought. In his most significant court victory, the town of Marblehead in 1791 was forced to return his confiscated home and shop, this building here, one of the few colonial-era brick houses in town. Another Essex County resident had a less joyful outcome. Returning to Salem after the war, Samuel Kerwin discovered that his estate had been squandered through his wife's infatuation with her nephew. According to Kerwin, the nephew was, quote, restrained by no principle, but a want of money to buy rum and furnish a whore or flourish away in a tavern. Kerwin's, end of that quote, Kerwin's nephew had persuaded his aunt to give him the key to Kerwin's books, coin collection, and wine cellar. Samuel Kerwin Samuel Kerwin beseeched that his wife's remains not be joined with his after death, and that he would be not a little deranged to find her at his side on resurrection morning. With the end of the War of Independence, the country was militarily exhausted and financially shattered. The peace with Great Britain was rocky, as were the relations between Royalists and Patriots within the state of Massachusetts in particular. Its citizens faced the conundrum of how to return to a satisfactory condition of equity and equilibrium between the former foes, Loyalists, many of whom had fled the state but then returned, and Patriots who had remained to fight the battle for independence. I'd like to read to you a letter from Thomas Hutchinson Jr. to his brother in 1788, which very succinctly describes the situation, the difficult situation that the Loyalists found themselves in. These unfortunate people were difficultly placed. If they had joined the American party, they would have been rebels to England. But when the war was over and they applied for the restitution of their estates, they were told they were rebels. They were rebels to America. Massachusetts presented a confounding number of reactions by and toward its Loyalists, as we had just seen. Some Loyalists had fled of their own accord to new homes in Canada or across the Atlantic. Some had decided to stick it out among their neighbors. in Massachusetts. Some Loyalists had been forbidden by name in the Massachusetts Banishment Act to return to the state upon punishment by death, but they came back anyway and were treated harshly upon returning home. The opinion of most of the Patriot persuasion was that those Loyalists had backed the wrong horse and lost, so too bad for them. And yet some Loyalists managed to return to their home state without much trouble. It was time to build a new nation, but could it be done and would it be done? Because the 1778 Massachusetts Banishment Act authorized exile of returning Tories without trial by jury, it was in essence a bill of attainder, which is legislation that imposes punishment on a specific person or group of people without a judicial trial. As such, bills of attainder were forbidden by both the U.S. Constitution, ratified in 1778, and the Massachusetts Constitution, ratified 2 years after that. Moreover, the need for a favorable commercial treaty with England and the evacuation of British forces in the West argued for repealing or ignoring acts that did not promote unity and amnesty. As the 1780s, wore on, feelings softened and enmity began to dissipate. In April 1787, the Massachusetts legislature, with no dissenters, passed a law offering Tories a general amnesty and repealing selective assessments of returning exiles' suitability to return. Over the next 3 years, the legislature granted citizenship to 9 returned Tories and decided favorably several petitions concerning confiscated estates. Though initially a mixed bag, the treatment of Loyalists who had returned post-war to Massachusetts improved as time went on. It helped that prominent citizens such as John Adams on the left and Congressional Representative Theodore Sedgwick on the right believed that prosperous, well-educated Loyalist returnees would benefit the state's economy, and so encouraged and welcomed most of them. Other less prominent citizens recognized that Tories with needed skills or capital would help restore the economic, political, and social fabric. So ordinary citizens, too, eventually welcomed returning Loyalists. Amity returning one's former Loyalist stance began to prevail in the new republic, and Massachusetts put its efforts toward helping to build a new nation. I think it's fair to say that by the 1790s, amity generally prevailed in the new republic. As recounted by David E. Moss, a chronicler of the Loyalist endeavor, and I'll close my talk with this quote from him. The statesmen of the Bay State realized by 1779 or so that mercy was better than vindictiveness. In reality, they had little to fear and much to gain through the careful screening and admission of contrite refugees. The state soon resumed its earlier policy of humane and selective admission as public vehemence and bitterness quickly subsided. Despite all the warnings of the prophets of doom that the readmission of Tories would end republicanism in America, Massachusetts successfully welcomed its prodigal sons back to their home. As I said at the beginning, I'm be happy to entertain questions, comments, and elaborations. And if I can't get to them all, write me at this email address down here, and I'll be glad to try to get to them after this talk is over the next week or two. So, questions? Are you there?
I am here and
Good.
I'm right on board. Okay, the first question is from Robert. Did some of the staunch loyalists during the American Revolution fight against America in the War of 1812?
Oh, interesting question.
Hmm.
And I don't know the answer to that. I, some of them did leave and went up to Canada. Um, So it's conceivable that that may have happened, but I do not know for sure.
Well, Robert also asked, did all loyalists who successfully returned have to take an oath of allegiance to America?
I did not read of a particular oath that they had to take. They did go through kind of a vetting process with either committee of correspondence or in some cases with people from the state legislature. Um, but I don't know the specific details of whether that occurred or not.
That makes sense. I know we've never actually discovered proof that Isaac Jones took an oath of allegiance. We just assume he did because he started working for the Patriot cause. So there's a lot of unanswered questions about those kind of things. Um,
Hmm.
I have just a comment from Karen B, who said, a great presentation. Thank you. Um,
Thank you, Karen B.
and I'm just looking. Oops, I'll go back through. That is all I have right now. And let me see. We've also, well, we still have a little bit more time. So if there's anything else you want to add, that was wonderful, by the way. You always learn something new about loyalists, I think.
Hmm.
Yeah.
The only thing I would have to say is history is full of these, American history in particular, full of these what I call singular moments in American history, and they proved to me to be endlessly fascinating. It's the kind of thing that the standard textbooks, particularly those that you may get in school, um, don't go into to any great extent. Of course, they can't. They've got to cover the whole span of this. But when you look behind the events, uh, you can find some really interesting stories. And in fact, some of those are in talks that I've developed or in the process of developing about what went on immediately. This one, the race to remember, what went on immediately after the Battle of Lexington and Concord to convince both your own friends and your foes of the rightness of your cause. And this was both on the American side and on the British side. So it really was a race to get the word out, which I won't tell you who won or how they won, but it made for a fascinating story. Or this one, which I think you and I talked about the other day, the slave who was a spy. This was a enslaved man in Virginia who um, essentially worked his way into Cornwallis's camp in Yorktown, Virginia, saying that he was an escaped slave who ultimately served as a double agent in that he stayed in Cornwallis's camp and could overhear because he was waiting on their tables of all the officers their plans and their talk, and who then relayed his information to other slaves who were escaped, who then relayed it back to um, General the Marquis de Lafayette, who was aiding the Americans in battle at that time
I
in
remember.
Virginia.
And
Mhm.
Roberts asked another question about what happened to Black loyalists who wanted to return to America. Were they treated differently at that time?
My guess is yes,
Hmm.
uh, because they were always, if you were black, you were not treated as well or as equal to if you were white. So my
Yes.
guess is that they were, but I don't know particular stories about black slaves who returned back to the United States. They were, since they were, as you might say, traitors, they might have had the same difficulties that other loyalists were when they tried to get back to the United States.
So there
Of
was
course,
nothing specifically for
they
them to come back.
mhm.
There's
Say that again.
nothing specifically forbidding them to come back. But
At
you
least not in the Banishment Act of the state of Massachusetts.
okay. And Katie has asked that you had mentioned a number of loyalists who raced to the Battle of Lexington and Concord. How did they hear it was happening?
Um, that's a whole interesting, fascinating thing. There were communication networks we think of networks as wired things, but in colonial times there were communication networks that started out in where information was exchanged up and down these networks. Frequently, the networks um, were took over Indian paths and had riders going from one place to another. There's a very interesting book by Catherine Grandjean about that whole communication aspect in colonial times, and fascinating things that the way that they got the word out, and in the talk that I talked about at first, the A Race to Remember, um, writers specifically uh, took took written communications and went to the next post where they left these written communications, which were then copied by hand and given to other writers who went on in other directions. So a fascinating way that the word was spread before the era of telephones, telegraph, wires, electricity, and so on. The word did get out.
I have one last question. Robert also mentioned that was James Armistead Lafayette, which, yeah, we did talk about. That was his name. I actually wrote that down because I would like to learn more about him. But Pam Fox, who is actually the president of Weston Historical Society and who's here, she said, or she asked, hang on, let's see what so we have Elisha Jones, who was run out of Weston and his property was confiscated. And I believe he was Isaac Jones' cousin. His sons later appealed to the Crown for compensation. And she's asking, were some loyalists compensated by the English?
Well, in some respects, yes. I mean, who was it? Um, Betsy Loring. I think I mentioned that she was given a pension by the
Oh, yes.
British government till her death. I know for a fact that pensions were provided for at least some loyalists who ended up in England or kept their contacts with England. Yeah.
Wonderful. And thank you, Robert, again for all your questions. We actually have come to just 1 minute till the end of our hour. And I want to thank everybody who came, who was here today, and all the people who will watch in the future. But most importantly, to thank you, Larry. That was wonderful. Very enjoyable and very informative.
Okay, well, I want to thank everyone for their attention, and particularly for these probing questions that you asked. And as I said, if anybody has any other questions, comments, elaborations, get in touch with me by email afterwards.
Okay, and Robert said, thank you for your talk. And yes, it's a resounding success, and thank you so much, Larry. We really appreciate it.
Okay, bye.
This is, yeah, good night to everybody, and take good care.